The first time I understood, I was a disappointment. I was 7 years old. It wasn't a loud, dramatic realization. It was a quiet one, seeping into my bones like a winter chill. My father had just finished meticulously arranging his collection of lead crystal figurines on the mantelpiece. Each one was a tiny, glittering testament to order, precision, and value. He placed the final piece, a delicate stag, and took a step back, a rare smile touching his lips. "See, Alara?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "Everything has its place, a purpose, a defined value." I, clutching a lump of purple and green clay I had molded into what I believed was a magnificent, if somewhat lopsided dragon, felt my own value deflate like a punctured balloon. My dragon had no place on that mantelpiece. It was messy, unpredictable, and born of an imagination that had no quantifiable worth in my father's world. My mother, from her chair, offered a gentle but distant smile. "That's lovely, dear. But maybe keep your creations on the desk in your room." My room. The designated space for things without a defined place in their perfect, ordered world. That was the blueprint of my childhood. Our house was a museum of acceptable achievements. My brother, Liam, 4 years my senior, was the star exhibit. His straight-A report cards were framed. His soccer trophies gleamed from a dedicated shelf. He was living his life according to the precise, pre-drawn schematics our parents had laid out for him. Prestigious school, economics degree, a fast-track career in finance. He was the son they could point to with unadulterated pride. I was the cracked vase in the corner, the one they tried to hide behind larger, more perfect pieces. My reports cards were a mosaic of A's in English and art, and C's in math and science. "If only you applied yourself, Alara," my mother would sigh, as if my passion for storytelling and drawing was a distracting fungus, not a fundamental part of my DNA. "You have so much potential, but you scatter it to the wind." My potential, in their eyes, was a single narrow path. They saw my creativity not as a talent, but as a disability, a refusal to conform, a deliberate act of rebellion. The grand unveiling of my life's plan was the crescendo of my disappointment. I was 17, sitting at the heavy mahogany dinner table. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and unspoken expectations. Liam had just announced his acceptance into a top-tier MBA program. The congratulatory atmosphere was palpable. I felt the weight of the moment, the pressure in my chest. It was now or never. I took a deep breath. "I've decided," I said, my voice trembling only slightly. "I've been accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design. For illustration." The silence that followed was more crushing than any argument. My father put down his fork. The gentle clink against the china plate sounded like a gavel. "Illustration," he repeated, the word flat and lifeless on his tongue. "You want to draw pictures?" "For a living." "It's a premier institution, Dad. It's a real career. Graphic design, animation, book illustration." "Alara," my mother interjected, her voice laced with a concern that felt like condescension. "Be practical." "What is the practical application of that? How will you support yourself? How will you build a future? It's a hobby, not a profession." The conversation, if you could call it that, spiraled from there. It was a torrent of words like unstable, impractical, a dead end. They presented me with alternatives like a business degree with a fun minor in art. They begged me to be sensible, like Liam. But for the first time, their disappointment didn't shrink me. It ignited me. The heat of their dismissal forged a stubborn resolve in my core. Looking at their faces, so full of genuine bafflement at my choices, I realized I would never find my reflection in their eyes. I would have to build my own mirror. "This is what I'm doing," I said, my voice finally steady. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you, the fallout was nuclear." They didn't speak to me for a week. When they did, it was with a frosty resignation. They agreed to pay for a single semester. "1 semester," my father said, his eyes cold. "To get this foolishness out of your system. Then you transfer to a real school and get a real degree. We are not funding a fantasy." I took the single semester. It was my lifeline. Moving to Providence was like breathing for the first time. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility, thick with the smell of turpentine, ink, and ambition. I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, who understood that a splash of color or a perfectly inked line could hold more truth than a spreadsheet. I worked until my fingers cramped. surviving on cheap coffee and the intoxicating high of creation. I wasn't the best in my class, but I was, without a doubt, the most determined. My parents' funding evaporated after those 4 months, as promised. The phone call to ask for more, to beg for just one more semester, was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. "I told you the terms, Alara," my father said, his voice crackling down the line. "The experiment is over. Come home. We'll enroll you in the community college for the spring semester. You can still salvage this. Salvage." As if my life was a shipwreck. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm staying." I heard my mother in the background. "Robert, don't be too hard on her." "Alara, honey, it's time to grow up." I hung up. That was the moment the final thread snapped. I was on my own. The next 5 years were a blur of struggle that would have made my parents' worst fears seem prophetic. I waitressed. I walked dogs. I did freelance design jobs for pennies. I lived in a cramped apartment with 3 roommates, where my room was a curtained-off section of the living room. I existed on a diet of rice and beans, and my social life was a luxury I couldn't afford. There were many, many nights I cried myself to sleep. The weight of my isolation and exhaustion of physical pain. Was this it? Was this the fantasy they warned me about? But even in the depths of it, there was a core of steel that wouldn't bend. Every time I felt like giving up, I would remember the cold finality in my father's voice. I would picture the mantelpiece with its perfect figurines. I would rather be a starving artist than a well-fed ghost in their world. I scraped together enough to finish my degree through a combination of massive student loans and sheer willpower. After graduation, the struggle simply evolved. I moved to New York, a tiny speck in a massive, indifferent city. I took a soul-crushing job as a junior designer at a generic marketing firm, my creativity stifled under layers of corporate bureaucracy. My task was to make other people's bland ideas look marginally better. It paid the rent on my microscopic studio apartment, but it was killing me by inches. My contact with my parents during this time was minimal, reduced to stilted birthday calls and obligatory holiday visits that were exercises in quiet misery. Their house was still a museum, and I was still the cracked vase. Liam was now a rising star at his hedge fund, engaged to a perfectly pleasant lawyer named Sarah. Their conversations were a foreign language of stock options, property values, and Caribbean vacations. I would sit silently, nodding, my own life feeling like a dingy black-and-white film compared to their Technicolor success story. The turning point, as it often is, was born from desperation. I was 26, sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by takeout containers, staring at a rejection letter for a promotion I knew I deserved. The senior creative director had said my work was too niche, not commercially viable enough. A white-hot fury boiled up inside me. Not commercially viable? My work? The work I bled for? It was the same refrain, just a different choir. Be practical. Get a real job. Your ideas have no defined value. That night, I didn't cry. I got out my tablet, and I started to draw. Not for a client, not for a boss, not for a grade, for me. I drew a character I'd been sketching in the margins of my notebooks for years. A young, scrappy gardener named Lyra, who could communicate with plants. She was an outcast in her own village, her talent seen as a strange quirk, useless compared to the blacksmith's strength or the baker's practicality. I drew her tending to a neglected thorny vine that everyone feared. I drew her whispering to it, and I drew the vine unfurling, not into a flower, but into a cascade of tiny glowing lanterns that lit up the entire night. It was a story about hidden potential, about value that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. On a whim, fueled by that rebellious fury, I posted the illustration on a popular online art community. I wrote a short paragraph about Lyra. I called it The Lantern Keeper. Then I went to bed, expecting nothing. The next morning, my phone was buzzing incessantly. The post had gone viral. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. People were asking for more. They were connecting with Lyra's story. They wanted to know her world. A message popped up in my inbox. It was from a small, independent literary agent who specialized in graphic novels. "This is breathtaking," the message read. The emotion, the world building in a single image. "Do you have more? Have you ever thought of turning this into a book?" I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. It was the first time, outside of my own stubborn belief, that an outside voice had looked at my foolishness and seen not a fantasy, but a future. That message wasn't just an offer, it was a validation. It was the first small crack of light in a door I had been pushing against my entire life, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was going to push it wide open. The message from the literary agent, a woman named Isabel Reed, felt like a lifeline thrown to me in the middle of a stormy sea. I read her words over and over, each time a fresh wave of disbelief washing over me. Breathtaking. Emotion. World-building. These were not words my parents or my corporate bosses had ever used to describe my work. They were the words I had desperately needed to hear for most of my life. I spent 3 days crafting my reply to Isabel, each draft scrutinized and rewritten until it was a precarious balance of professional enthusiasm and sheer, unadulterated terror. I attached a portfolio of my other sketches of Lyra and her world. The gloomy village of Briarfell, the mysterious, sentient forest that bordered it, the characters who saw Lyra as either a witch or a waste of space. I wrote a brief synopsis of the story I saw unfolding in my head. A tale not just about talking to plants, but about healing, about finding light in forgotten places, about the quiet strength of empathy in a world that valued only loud power. Isabel's response was immediate and electric. "Alara, this is a universe. Let's talk." Our first phone call lasted 2 hours. I remember clutching the phone in my tiny, dim apartment, the city's sirens a distant chorus to my pounding heart. Isabel's voice was warm, sharp, and incisive. She didn't just see a pretty picture. She saw the narrative woven into the lines and shadows. "Lyra is every creative person who's ever been told their gift is useless," she said. And I felt a jolt of recognition so strong it brought tears to my eyes. "We need to get this out there." There was just one monumental problem. To create a full-length graphic novel, I would need time. A lot of it. The kind of time my soul-crushing day job actively siphoned away from me. Isabel explained the process. She was confident she could get a publisher interested based on the concept art and a detailed proposal. But the advance for a debut author wouldn't be enough to live on. It would be a modest sum, a token of faith, not a salary. I was at a crossroads more defined than any I had faced before. Quitting my job meant diving headfirst into the very unstable fantasy my parents had warned me about. It meant burning the last vestige of a safety net I had, but staying meant letting this chance, this validation of my entire existence, slip through my fingers. The fear was a physical weight, a cold stone in my gut. That weekend, I made the obligatory quarterly visit to my parents' house. It was Liam's birthday. The house was immaculate, as always, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of conversation about mortgage rates and investment portfolios. Liam and Sarah were the center of attention, beaming as they discussed their recent purchase of a starter home that cost more than I would earn in a decade. My mother greeted me with a tense hug. "You look tired, Alara. Are you eating enough?" It was her standard greeting, a code for, "Your life is clearly not working out." I endured the dinner. I smiled politely as Liam recounted a triumphant deal he'd closed. I nodded as my father expounded on the wisdom of buying municipal bonds. Then, during a lull, a strange courage, born from Isabel's belief, took hold of me. "I've had some exciting news," I said, my voice cutting through the clatter of dessert forks. "A literary agent wants to represent me. I'm going to be creating a graphic novel." The silence was familiar, but this time, I was braced for it. It was my mother who broke it, her voice dripping with a concern that was really just thinly veiled anxiety. "An agent? That sounds serious. But darling, what about your job? You can't just give up a steady paycheck for a project. It's more than a project, Mom. It's a book, a real one, and I am going to quit my job to focus on it." The table went completely quiet. My father put down his wine glass, the crystal ringing sharply against the wood. "Ilara, that is the most irresponsible thing I have ever heard you say," he stated, his voice low and cold. "You have a career, a difficult one to get, I might add. You're going to throw it away on a children's book?" "It's not a children's book," I said, my knuckles white as I gripped my napkin under the table. "And it's not irresponsible. It's an investment in myself." Liam chuckled, a condescending sound that made my skin prickle. Come on, Alara, be realistic. How much is this advance if you even get one? Can it cover your rent? Your student loans? This is a hobby, not a career move. In that moment, surrounded by their dismissive, fearful faces, my decision was solidified. Their world was a gilded cage, and they were terrified of anyone who dared to fly outside of it. This wasn't about practicality. It was about control. They needed my life to fit their narrative of success, to validate their own choices. I'm not asking for permission, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken as a teenager. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm telling you what I'm doing. My life, my choices. I left then, walking out of their perfect house into the cool night air. It was the most liberating, terrifying walk of my life. I was truly alone now. The umbilical cord had not just been cut. It had been severed with a deliberate, final slash. The next Monday, I quit my job. My boss was unsurprised, almost relieved. I was, after all, too niche. I used my meager savings to pay 1 month's rent and bought a giant bag of rice and beans. Then, I built a fortress of solitude and determination around myself. The following year was a grind of a different, more intense kind than any I had experienced before. It was waking up at 5 a.m. to draw for 3 hours before the world intruded. It was surviving on freelance illustration gigs that were barely enough to keep the lights on. It was saying no to every invitation, every distraction. My social life evaporated. My apartment became a cave of storyboards, reference books, and empty coffee mugs. Isabel was my rock. She guided me through the process of crafting the proposal, of pitching to publishers. There were rejections. Some editors didn't connect with the protagonist. Others didn't see a market for quiet, literary graphic novels. Each rejection was a small puncture wound, but Isabel's unwavering belief was the sealant that kept me from deflating completely. And then, after 6 months of this roller coaster, we got a yes. It was from a respected mid-sized publisher known for taking risks on unique voices. The advance was, as predicted, small, but it was a yes. Someone was going to pay me to create my world. The day the contract arrived, I sat on my floor and wept. Not tears of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering validation. The real work began then. Creating the book was a marathon of obsession. I lived and breathed Briarfell. Lyra's struggles became my own. Her feeling of being an outsider, her quiet perseverance, her connection to something beautiful that others couldn't see. It was all my story, translated into ink and color. There were days of excruciating self-doubt, where every line looked wrong, where the entire premise felt as foolish as my family had claimed. But I would remember the coldness at the dinner table, the sound of Liam's condescending chuckle, and I would push through. 2 years after I walked out of my parents' house, The Lantern Keeper was published. The day the first box of author copies arrived at my door, I tore it open with trembling hands, holding the physical book, smelling the ink and paper, seeing my name on the cover. It was a feeling that defied description. It was a tangible thing, a weight in my hands that was the opposite of the emptiness I had felt for so long. It was real. I had made it real. The reviews started trickling in. They were good. Really good. A major book blog called it a stunning debut, a visually arresting and emotionally resonant modern fable. Trade publications praised the art and the nuanced storytelling. It wasn't a blockbuster overnight, but it was a critical darling. It found its audience, a dedicated, passionate group of readers who saw in Lyra what Isabel had seen, what I had felt. The publisher ordered a second printing. Then a third. Foreign rights were sold. Then the thing that changes everything happened. A major streaming service contacted Isabel. They wanted to option the book for an animated series. The negotiation was a whirlwind. I was involved in every step, my head spinning from the numbers being discussed. When the deal was finally signed, the payment was more money than I had ever dreamed of possessing. It was enough to pay off my student loans 100 times over. It was financial freedom. I remember the day the wire transfer hit my bank account. I stared at the number on the screen, the string of digits that represented not just money, but vindication. I didn't scream or jump for joy. I sat in a profound, deafening silence. The stone of fear that had lived in my gut for a decade finally dissolved, replaced by a warm, steady glow of accomplishment. I had done it. I had taken their foolishness, and I had built a fortress with it. I bought a new apartment. Not a microscopic studio, but a bright, airy loft with space for a proper studio. I bought a new drawing tablet, the best on the market. I bought myself a single frivolous luxury, a beautiful hand-blown glass vase. I placed it empty on my windowsill. It was perfect, because it had no defined purpose other than to be beautiful. It was my mantelpiece, and I decided what belonged on it. I didn't call my parents. Why would I? Their silence over the past 2 years had been absolute. They had never once asked about the book. They were likely still waiting for me to come to my senses, to admit my failure and crawl back. They had no idea that the daughter they had written off as a disappointment was now, by their own most cherished metric, a staggering success. I was finally happy. I was finally free. But the universe, it seems, has a cruel sense of symmetry. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sketching concepts for the animated adaptation when my phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in over a year. It was my mother. A cold dread, entirely separate from the old fear, trickled down my spine. They didn't call to chat. They didn't call to see how I was. Something was wrong. I let it go to voicemail, my heart thumping a strange, irregular rhythm against my ribs. The fortress I had built felt suddenly, terrifyingly under siege. The voicemail notification glowed on my phone screen like a single accusing eye. I didn't need to listen to it. The mere fact of the call was a message in itself. My mother's name on the screen was an artifact from a past life, a fossil unearthed by some seismic shift I couldn't yet comprehend. For 2 days I let it sit there. I tried to lose myself in my work, in the vibrant, controllable world of Briarfell, but my focus was fractured. The call was a crack in my newfound peace, and the chill of the old world was seeping through. On the 3rd day, curiosity, or perhaps a morbid sense of obligation, got the better of me. I put on my headphones, took a deep breath, and pressed play. Alara? Honey, it's Mom. Her voice was strained, a forced lightness failing to mask a deep, resonant anxiety. It was a tone I recognized from childhood, used when Liam had failed a test, or when a stock market dip had worried my father. It was the sound of controlled panic. We just wanted to see how you are. It's been so long. A long pause, filled with the sound of her breathing. Your father came across an article online about your book. And some deal? It all sounded very big. We'd love to hear all about it. Another pause. Maybe you could come for dinner this weekend. Or we could come into the city. We could talk, properly. Please call me back, sweetheart. We miss you, the message ended. I sat in the silence of my loft, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. We saw an article. Of course they had. Their world was built on tracking success and failure, and my name had finally flickered onto their radar in a way they could understand. A financial transaction. They hadn't called when the book was published to congratulate me on the artistic achievement. They'd called when money entered the picture. The invitation felt less like an olive branch and more like a summons. We could talk, properly. What did that mean? An interrogation? An apology? A shakedown? The old, familiar ache of not measuring up began to pulse. But this time it was quickly smothered by a newer, fiercer emotion. Anger. Where was this concern when I was eating rice and beans in a glorified closet? Where was this familial love when I was defending my very existence at their dinner table? I didn't call back. I deleted the voicemail. But the damage was done. The ghost was in the room. A week later, a formal, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox, my name and address written in my mother's elegant looping script. Inside was a card, an invitation to my parents' 35th wedding anniversary party, a lavish catered affair at a country club, the kind of event where appearances were everything. My attendance or lack thereof would be a public statement. I held the heavy cardstock, my mind reeling. This was a trap, a beautifully calligraphed trap. If I didn't go, I would be the ungrateful daughter, the bitter artist who held a grudge, the final, irredeemable disappointment. If I did go, I would be walking back into the lion's den, subjecting my hard-won peace to their scrutiny. I would have to face them. For days, I warred with myself. Isabel noticed my distraction. "You're drawing Lyra like she's about to face a firing squad, not a magical forest," she commented during one of our check-ins. I confided in her, my words tumbling out in a frustrated rush. "Don't go," she said simply. You don't owe them anything, Alara. You built this without them. Protect it. She was right. I knew she was right. But a part of me, the little girl who had once desperately wanted to see pride in her father's eyes, was stubbornly alive. And that little girl was curious. What would they say? How would they look at me now that I had, by their own crude standards, made it? The decision was made for me by my own defiant pride. I would go. Not for them. For me. I would go not as the supplicant daughter, but as a successful woman. I would walk into that country club not as the cracked vase, but as the artist who had created her own porcelain from scratch. It was a test of my own armor. The day of the party, I dressed with deliberate care. I chose a simple, impeccably tailored black dress. Not flashy, but expensive in its quiet confidence. I wore the single piece of good jewelry I owned, a pair of small diamond studs I'd bought myself after the streaming deal. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a poised, successful stranger. I clung to that image. Driving into the manicured suburbs felt like traveling back in time. The perfectly symmetrical houses, the gleaming SUVs in every driveway, it was a landscape of conformity I had fought so hard to escape. The country club was even worse. A temple of old money privilege, all dark wood, brass fixtures, and the faint smell of golf course grass and leather. I could hear the party from the entrance, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of polite conversation. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The scene was exactly as I had pictured it. My parents stood near the fireplace, receiving a line of well-wishers. My mother looked elegant in a lavender sheath dress, her smile practiced and perfect. My father stood beside her, his posture rigid, his hand resting possessively on her back. For a moment, I was 7 years old again, holding my lumpy clay dragon. Then, my mother's eyes scanned the room and landed on me. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of shock, then something else. Appraisal. Before the perfect hostess mask slid back into place. She whispered something to my father. He turned and his gaze found me. There was no warmth in it. It was a cold, calculating look, the same one he used when assessing a business rival. I didn't approach them. I moved to the periphery, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. I saw Liam and Sarah holding court in a corner, surrounded by a group of people who looked just like them. Liam caught my eye, raised his glass in a slow, deliberate salute. His smile was tight. The first person to approach me was my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. She enveloped me in a cloud of Chanel No. 5. Ilara, my goodness, look at you. We heard you've become terribly famous. A movie star. Not quite, Aunt Carol. I wrote a book that's being adapted. A book. How wonderful. Your mother must be so proud. She said it with a genuine warmth that took me aback, but then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between us, dear, it's such a relief. After all the struggle. We were all so worried. But you've landed on your feet, and in such a glamorous way. Her words were a backhanded compliment, a reminder that my struggle had been a source of family gossip and pity. I smiled thinly and extricated myself. For an hour, I floated through the room, a ghost at the feast. I received a parade of similar comments. We always knew you had it in you. They hadn't. You must be so relieved to have found something that worked out. As if it were an accident. The subtext was clear. My success was a happy anomaly, a deviation from the expected narrative of my failure that they had all comfortably accepted. Then, my mother found me. She glided over, her smile brittle. Ilara, you came. I'm so glad. She air-kissed my cheek. You look... Well, thank you, Mom, you too. Happy anniversary. There was an awkward silence. Her eyes darted around the room, as if checking who was watching us. The party is lovely, I offered, for lack of anything else to say. Your father spared no expense, she said automatically. Then she looked directly at me, her gaze intense. We need to talk, Ilara, really talk. Not here, your father. He has something he needs to discuss with you. The chill I'd felt since the phone call returned, colder and sharper. Discuss? About what? Not here, she repeated, her voice a nervous whisper. It's a private matter, a family matter. Can you come by the house tomorrow? For coffee? Please. The plea in her voice was real, and it unnerved me more than any demand could have. The carefully constructed armor I'd worn all evening felt suddenly thin. I had walked in prepared for condescension or coldness. I wasn't prepared for this desperate secrecy. I looked over at my father. He was watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. The party swirled around him, a celebration of a lifetime of stability and control. But in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. "All right," I heard myself say, the word tasting like ash. "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. A wave of relief washed over my mother's face. "Thank you, darling. Thank you." She squeezed my arm, a gesture that felt alien and strangely final, before she was swept away by another guest. I left the party soon after, the champagne sour in my stomach. The victory I had anticipated felt hollow. I hadn't been met with a battle. I'd been met with a mystery, and the dread that had been a trickle was now a flood. A private matter. A family matter. The phrases echoed in my mind as I drove back to the city, back to my sanctuary that no longer felt entirely safe. I had gone to their party seeking closure, but I had only opened a new, more dangerous door. Tomorrow, I would have to walk through it. The drive to my parents' house the next morning was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every familiar street corner, every manicured lawn, whispered a memory of a time when I was smaller, softer, and desperately sought a approval that was always just out of reach. The defiant armor I had worn to the party had rusted overnight, replaced by a heavy, anxious dread. A private matter. A family matter. The words had echoed in my dreams, twisting into ominous shapes. I parked my sensible, used sedan a few doors down from their house, a childish habit from my teenage years when I didn't want them to see the state of my first beat-up car. Now it was a moment to gather my composure. Their house looked the same as ever, impeccably painted, symmetrical shrubs flanking the door, a silent testament to order and control. But for the first time I saw the strain in its perfection. The paint was a little too fresh, the shrubs a little too perfectly trimmed, as if trying to hold back an encroaching chaos. At exactly 10 o'clock, I walked to the door. Before I could ring the bell, it opened. My mother stood there, already dressed in a crisp linen outfit, but her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with a sleeplessness that mirrored my own. Ilara, right on time. She attempted a smile, but it was a weak, trembling thing. She ushered me inside. The house was silent. Oppressively so. The usual hum of the central air conditioning seemed muted. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway unnaturally loud. The air smelled of lemon polish and freshly brewed coffee, but underneath it was a faint, acrid scent of anxiety. "Your father is in the study," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's waiting for you, the study. My father's inner sanctum, the room where he managed the family's finances, where he had delivered his most serious pronouncements about my life." As a child, being summoned to the study was akin to being called to the principal's office. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I followed my mother down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner. The door to the study was ajar. My mother pushed it open gently. "Robert, Ilara's here." My father was seated behind his massive mahogany desk. He wasn't working. He was just sitting, his hands resting flat on the polished wood, as if anchoring himself. He looked older than he had just the night before. The carefully maintained veneer of unshakable confidence had cracked, revealing the weary, worried man beneath. "Ilara," he said, his voice gravelly. "Close the door." My mother hovered uncertainly for a moment before slipping out, pulling the door shut with a soft, definitive click. I was alone with him. The room was exactly as I remembered, walls lined with books on economics and history, the framed degrees, the large globe in the corner that I used to spin as a child, dreaming of places far away from this very room. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite the desk. I sat, perching on the edge, my back straight. I would not show him how nervous I was. I said nothing, waiting. I had learned long ago that silence was my father's preferred medium. He would fill it when he was ready. He cleared his throat, a rough, uncomfortable sound. He looked not at me, but at a point just over my shoulder. "Your mother and I, we appreciate you coming." It was a formal, stilted opening. You said you needed to discuss something, I prompted, my voice cooler than I felt. He finally met my gaze. His eyes, usually so sharp and dismissive, were clouded with something I couldn't immediately identify. Shame? Fear? A toxic cocktail of both? Yes. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I'm going to be direct, Alara. The situation is serious. He paused, as if waiting for me to flinch. I remained still. There have been some setbacks. Investments that did not perform as anticipated. The market, it's been volatile. He was speaking in the coded language of his world, but the meaning was clear. He had lost money. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, the words neutral, devoid of genuine sympathy. It's more than a simple downturn, he continued, his voice tightening. There was a significant venture, a partnership with a man I trusted implicitly. It was supposed to be a sure thing, a legacy investment for me and your mother, for Liam's future. His jaw worked. It was fraudulent. The entire operation. The man, he's gone, and the capital is gone with him. The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. My father, the man who had built his life on prudence and predictability, had been conned. The irony was so bitter it was almost funny. The master of defined value had been duped by a mirage. How much? I asked, the businesswoman in me, the one who now understood contracts and net worth taking over. He flinched, as if the directness of the question was a physical blow. He looked down at his hands. A substantial amount, enough that our liquidity is compromised. Severely. You're in debt, I translated, stripping away the euphemisms. His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a flicker of his old anger. It's a temporary liquidity shortfall, but it requires an immediate infusion to prevent cascading effects. Cascading effects. I imagined it like dominoes falling. The second mortgage called in. The country club membership revoked. The carefully constructed facade of wealth crumbling into dust. The very things that defined their existence. What does this have to do with me? I asked, though I already knew. The dread had crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. He took a deep breath, the kind you take before jumping into icy water. We need your help, Alara. The words seemed to cost him a great deal. The sum required is considerable. We need a loan, a bridge loan, to see us through this period until we can restructure. There it was. The ask. The reason for the phone call, the invitation, the desperate plea from my mother. It wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about me. It was about my bank account. The silence in the room was profound. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I looked at my father, the proud, unyielding man who had told me my dreams were worthless, now sitting before me, asking for a handout. The little girl inside me wanted to weep. The woman I had become wanted to scream. A loan, I repeated, letting the words sit between us. You want to borrow money from me? It would be a formal arrangement, of course, he said quickly, grasping at the semblance of a business transaction. We would draw up papers, interest, a repayment schedule. We are not asking for a gift, aren't you? I asked softly. After everything? After telling me my chosen path would lead to ruin? After years of treating me like a failed experiment? You're now coming to me because my foolishness somehow paid off? His face hardened. The shame was being rapidly replaced by indignation. This was not going the way he had planned. He was used to giving orders, not being questioned. This is not about the past, Alara. This is about family. About helping your family in a time of need. Family, I said, the word tasting like poison. When was the last time you thought of me as family, Dad? When you gave me 1 semester of funding and told me to give up my fantasy? When you sat in silence while Liam mocked my career? Was that family? That is ancient history, he snapped, his composure finally breaking. We are talking about a real present-day crisis. Your mother is sick with worry. This could cost us everything. I know what it's like to have nothing. I shot back, my own anger rising hot and sharp. I know what it's like to choose between rent and groceries. Where was my family then? Did you lie awake at night, sick with worry about me? Or did you just assume I was getting what I deserved for not following the plan? He stared at me, his face a mask of stunned fury. I had never spoken to him like this. I had always been the one to back down, to retreat, but I had nothing to lose now. He was the one with his back against the wall. This is your mother's home, Alara. he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register. This is the life we have built. Are you really so selfish, so vindictive, that you would stand by and watch it collapse over some childhood grievances? Childhood grievances. He made it sound so trivial. He had no idea that his rejection had been the foundational trauma of my life, the furnace that had both burned me and forged me. I stood up. My legs were trembling, but my voice was steady. I need to think about this. It was a lie. I already knew my answer, but I wouldn't give it to him here, in his study, on his terms. I needed to reclaim my power. I needed to walk away. Panic flashed in his eyes. He hadn't expected a maybe. He had expected either a grateful capitulation or a refusal he could use to paint me as the villain. Hesitation unnerved him. Elara, there is no time to think. The bank... I said I need to think about it, I repeated, cutting him off. I turned and walked toward the door. Your mother won't survive this, he said to my back, his voice stripped bare now, raw with a desperation that was probably genuine. It was his final, cruelest weapon. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. I'll be in touch. I walked out of the study, past my mother who was waiting in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes pleading. I didn't stop. I walked out of their perfect house, got into my car, and drove away. But I didn't go home. I drove to the park, to a quiet spot by the river. I sat on a bench and watched the water flow, relentless and indifferent. The confrontation had left me shaking, not with fear, but with a seismic, world-altering clarity. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. I held the strings now, and I had a decision to make. It wasn't just about money. It was about justice. It was about healing. It was about finally, after a lifetime, setting the terms of my own worth. The river flowed past, a brown, churning ribbon oblivious to the tectonic shift happening on its banks. I sat on the bench until my hands stopped shaking, and the cold knot of anger in my stomach dissolved into a different, more complex emotion. A weary, profound clarity. The confrontation with my father hadn't been a battle. It had been an unveiling. The illusion was finally shattered. Their love, their approval, their very concept of family was conditional. It was a transaction, and I had just been informed that my account was now in credit. I drove back to my loft in a trance. The city, usually a chaotic symphony of noise and movement, felt distant, muted. Inside my sanctuary, the silence was deafening. I walked to the empty, hand-blown glass vase on my windowsill. I ran a finger along its smooth, cool rim. It was beautiful precisely because it held nothing. It demanded nothing. It was a perfect vessel for potential, not a display case for predefined trophies. My father's words echoed. A formal arrangement, interest, a repayment schedule. He wanted to reduce this, the most emotionally charged moment of our lives, to a business deal. Because that was the only language he understood. The language of ledgers and collateral. Well, if that was the language he wanted to speak, then I would become fluent. But I would write the terms. For 2 days, I didn't leave the loft. I ignored calls from Isabel, who was worried about my radio silence. I ignored the increasingly desperate text messages from my mother. Please, Elara, call us. Your father didn't mean to be harsh. We're family. Family. The word had lost all meaning. It was a hollow shell. I thought about Liam. Where was he in all this? The golden child, the heir apparent. Surely he would bail them out. A quick call to my brother confirmed the final pathetic piece of the puzzle. Elara, he said, his voice strained, the usual condescension replaced by a harried anxiety. Thank God you called. Have you talked to Dad? I have. Then you know. It's a disaster. A complete fucking disaster. It was the first time I'd ever heard him swear. I've sunk everything I have into trying to plug the holes. Sarah's parents. We had to go to them. It's humiliating. But it's not enough. The amount he needs, it's... He trailed off, and in his silence, I heard it. The sound of the perfect sun hitting his limit. He had followed the blueprint exactly, and it had led him to the same cliff's edge. The realization was almost poetic. So, you can't help them, I stated. I've tried, he snapped defensively. But this is on a different scale. He's talking about losing the house, Alara. Mom's house. He was using the same emotional blackmail as my father. Mom's house. Not their house. Mom's. Positioning her as the ultimate victim, the fragile treasure we all had to protect. It was a clever, manipulative tactic, and it solidified my resolve. They were a unit. My parents, Liam, they were a closed system that had always excluded me. Now that the system was failing, they were trying to draft me in as a financial first responder, all while refusing to acknowledge the structural flaws that had caused the collapse in the first place. My worth was still conditional. It was just that the condition had changed from obedience to solvency. On the third day, I picked up my phone. I didn't call my mother. I called my father's direct line. He answered on the first ring. Alara. His voice was tight, expectant. I've considered your proposal, I said, my tone flat, professional. I'm willing to provide the loan. I heard his sharp intake of breath, a rush of relief so palpable it was almost a sound in itself. Alara, thank you. I knew you'd... I'm not finished, I interrupted. These are my terms. I will transfer the full amount you specified. The loan will be interest-free. Alara, that's not necessary. It's not a negotiation, I said, my voice cutting through his. It's interest-free. However, there are conditions. A silence. I could feel his wariness through the phone. Condition 1. You and Mom will sign a legally binding promissory note, drafted by my lawyer. It will outline a strict, monthly repayment schedule for a term of 10 years. No exceptions, no delays. 10 years? Alara, that's... Condition 2. I continued, relentless. You will provide me with full, transparent disclosure of your financial situation. All accounts, all debts, all assets. My financial advisor will review everything. There will be no more secrets. He was silent now. I was treating him like a risky startup, not a father. And that was the point. Condition 3. You will never, ever again refer to my career, my choices, or my life as a fantasy, a hobby, or a foolishness. You will never compare me to Liam. In return, I will not bring up your failed investment, or the fact that you are now beholden to the daughter you dismissed. We will, for all intents and purposes, have a civil, distant relationship. But the past is buried. For good. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I had just offered him a lifeline, but I had coated it in gall. I was demanding not just money, but dignity. I was demanding a rewrite of our entire history. And if we don't agree to these conditions, he asked, his voice low and hoarse, then you can take your temporary liquidity shortfall to a bank, I said simply. I wish you the best of luck. I knew he couldn't. He had already tried. His pride had already been broken. I was just asking him to surrender the pieces. I need to discuss this with your mother, he finally said, defeat seeping into every word. Of course, you have 24 hours. I hung up. My heart was pounding, but my hand was steady. I had just orchestrated the most difficult deal of my life. I wasn't just lending them money. I was purchasing my freedom. I was buying the deed to my own self-worth. They called back in 18 hours. My mother's voice was small, broken. We accept your terms, Alara. There was no gratitude. There was only a bleak resignation. I had won, but it felt like a victory carved from stone, cold and heavy. The following week was a surreal parade of paperwork. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Evans, handled everything. The meeting. At her office to sign the documents was a study in excruciating awkwardness. My parents sat across the table from me, not making eye contact. They looked like strangers, aged and diminished. They signed the promissory note, a document that legally enshrined their failure and my success. My father's signature was a shaky scrawl. My mother's was barely a whisper of ink. When it was over, they stood up to leave. My father paused at the door and looked back at me. It wasn't a look of hatred, or even anger. It was a look of utter, bewildered loss. He had spent his life building a fortress of financial security, and the foundation had been pulled out from under him by a con man, and the person holding the key to the new, fragile gate was the daughter he had never understood. The world had stopped making sense to him. I transferred the money that afternoon. The digital confirmation felt anticlimactic. A lifetime of struggle, a decade of yearning, boiled down to a number on a screen and a legally binding contract. That night, I stood again at my window, looking out at the glittering city. The empty vase beside me seemed to glow in the moonlight. I had thought this moment would feel like triumph. I thought I would feel powerful, vindicated, ecstatic. But I didn't. I felt tired and sad and free. The war was over. The terms of surrender had been signed. I had my peace. It was a quiet, lonely peace, but it was mine. I had proven my value in the only currency they recognized. And in doing so, I had finally liberated myself from the desperate need to have them recognize it in any other way. The little girl with the lumpy clay dragon could finally rest. The artist had built her own world, and now she had finally, fully, evicted the ghosts of the old one. Or so I thought. Of course, here is the final part of the story. The transfer of the money created a silence deeper than any that had existed before. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the heavy, watchful hush that follows a detonation. The debt, now a formal, legal entity, stood between my parents and me like a glass wall. We could see each other, but all sound, all warmth, was filtered out. For the first 3 months, the automated payments hit my account on the first of every month with cold precision. There was no accompanying email, no text message. It was just a transaction, exactly as I had dictated. I told myself this was what I wanted, this clean, emotionless severance. The power balance had been corrected, the scales of justice, in my own flawed way, balanced. But power is a curious thing. It doesn't always feel the way you expect. The initial surge of vindication faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. I had wanted to prove my worth, and I had, but the audience I had been performing for my entire life was now broken, their applause replaced by averted eyes and signed checks. The victory felt sterile. My life, in every other aspect, was flourishing. The animated adaptation of The Lantern Keeper was greenlit, and I was deeply involved in the creative process. My second book was climbing the bestseller lists. My loft was filled with light and the quiet hum of a career I loved. I had friends, colleagues, a world that celebrated me. Yet, the ghost of my family's disappointment had not been exorcised by the loan. It had simply changed form. It was now the ghost of their humiliation. Isabel noticed the change in me. "You got what you wanted, Alara," she said one day over coffee, her gaze perceptive. "You held the cards and you played them, but you don't look like someone who won a hand. You look like someone who lost something they can't name." I couldn't articulate what I had lost. The hope, perhaps. The childish, stubborn hope that one day they would see me. Not my success, not my bank account, but me, and love me for it. That hope was now truly, irrevocably dead. I had killed it myself with my terms and conditions. It had been a toxic hope, a parasitic vine choking my growth, but its absence left a scar. A year after the loan was initiated, my mother called. It was a Tuesday morning. The caller ID flashed on my screen, and a cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't a payment date. This was different, I answered. Mom? Ilara. Her voice was thin, wavering. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch. Sometime, just us. The request was so unexpected, so outside the bounds of our new contractual relationship, that I was speechless for a moment. The old defenses slammed into place. Was this a ploy? An attempt to renegotiate the terms? Why? I asked, the word coming out harsher than I intended. She sighed, a sound of profound weariness. Because I miss my daughter. And because I think I owe you an apology that doesn't come with a monthly statement. The honesty in her voice disarmed me. It was stripped of manipulation, raw and simple. Against my better judgment, against all the walls I had so carefully built, I heard myself say, "All right, lunch next week." We met at a quiet, sun-drenched cafe far from both our neighborhoods, a neutral territory. When I saw her sitting alone at a table, she looked smaller. The elegant armor of her designer clothes seemed to hang on her a little looser. She saw me and offered a tentative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The first 15 minutes were agonizingly polite. We talked about the weather, about a movie she had seen. It was the conversation of two distant acquaintances. The chasm between us felt wider than ever. Then, as the waiter brought our food, she put down her fork and looked directly at me. "I was wrong, Ilara," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Your father was wrong. We are wrong." I froze, a piece of salad halfway to my mouth. I said nothing, just waited. "We thought we were protecting you," she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. "We thought the world was a hard, cruel place, and that the only way to survive was to be hard and practical within it. We saw your creativity as a vulnerability, a crack in your armor that the world would exploit." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "But we were the ones who exploited it. We were the ones who made you feel that the most beautiful parts of you were something to be ashamed of." Tears welled in my own eyes, but I blinked them back fiercely. "I would not cry. Not here. I watched you at that party," she said. "The anniversary party. You were so sure of yourself, so poised. You didn't need our approval anymore. And I felt a pride I had never felt before, but it was mixed with such a deep, terrible shame, because I realized we had never been proud of you for you. We were only proud when you fit into our box. And by the time you were magnificent enough to burst out of it, it was too late for us to claim any credit." She took a shaky sip of water. "The money, the loan. It's not about the money for me, Ilara. It's my penance. Every payment is a reminder of how we failed you, of how we valued the wrong things. Your father, he can't see it that way. For him, it's still a business transaction. It's the only language he has left. But for me, it's the price of my blindness." I listened, my heart thundering in my chest. This was the acknowledgement I had craved my entire life. It was here, being offered to me across a cafe table. But it didn't bring the soaring joy I had imagined. It brought a profound, aching sadness. For her, for my father, for the years we had lost. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice thick. "Because I'm losing him, Ilara," she whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "The humiliation. It's eaten away at him. He's a shell. He sits in that study all day, staring at the walls. The man I married, the man who was so certain of everything. He's gone, and I'm alone in that big empty house with the ghost of him and the crushing weight of what we did to you." She reached across the table, her hand hovering, not quite touching mine. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I see you now. However late it is, I see the incredible woman you are, and I am so sorry." I looked at my mother, truly looked at her. Not as an obstacle or a critic, but as a fallible, broken human being who had lived her life in a gilded cage of her own making and was now watching it rust shut around her. The anger I had clung to for so long suddenly felt like a heavy, useless weight. I didn't forgive her then. Not fully. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a path you choose to walk. But in that moment, I chose to take the first step. I placed my hand over hers. It was cold and frail. "Thank you for telling me, Mom," I said softly. It wasn't absolution. It was an acknowledgement. A beginning. We finished lunch. The conversation remained heavy, but the glass wall between us had developed a crack. We spoke about my work, about the animation, and for the first time, she asked questions not out of obligation, but with a genuine, timid curiosity. I drove home that day feeling emotionally scraped raw. The encounter with my mother had changed the equation. It was no longer about the debt. It was about debt of a different kind, an emotional one that couldn't be repaid with monthly installments. A few weeks later, I went to see my father. I didn't call ahead. I just went to the house. My mother let me in, her eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of hope. "He's in the study," she said. I walked down the familiar hallway. The door was closed. I knocked softly. "Come in." His voice was flat. I opened the door. He was sitting in his leather chair, but he wasn't at his desk. He was by the window, staring out at the perfect, empty backyard. He looked ancient. "Ilara," he said, not turning around. He must have recognized my footsteps. "Dad." I walked over and stood beside him. He didn't look at me. We stood in silence for a long time, watching a lone bird hop across the immaculate lawn. "I'm canceling the debt," I said quietly. That got his attention. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowed with confusion. "What?" "The loan. I'm forgiving the remaining balance. The payments stopped today." He stared at me, his face a mask of incredulity. "Why, this is some kind of trick. A power play." I shook my head, a sad smile touching my lips. "No, it's not a trick. It's a gift, with no conditions." "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. We agreed. The terms were for me, Dad, not for you. They were the terms I needed to survive dealing with you, but I don't need them anymore. I took a deep breath. I don't need you to be sorry. I don't need you to be proud. I just need you to know that I'm okay, and that I don't hate you. The defiance, the pride, the anger, it all drained from his face, leaving behind a naked, vulnerable old man. His shoulders slumped and he began to cry. It was a silent, shuddering weep, the kind that comes from a place too deep for sound. I didn't hug him. The distance between us was still too great for that. But I rested my hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it was a bridge. "The world you were so afraid of," I said softly. "The one you thought would break me. It's the world that made me. And it's not so hard and cruel when you have your own light to guide you." He didn't reply. He just covered my hand with his own, his grip surprisingly weak. It was the first time he had voluntarily touched me in over a decade. I left him there, by the window, with the ghost of his lost certainty and the beginnings of a new, fragile peace. The story doesn't have a tidy, happy ending. My father and I will never have a storybook relationship. The wounds are too old, the scars too thick. But the war is over. The ledger is closed. My mother visits my loft sometimes. She admires my work. She loves the empty glass vase, understanding its symbolism now. We talk. It's stilted at times, but it's real. As for me, I am finally, completely free. Not because I have money, or success, or even because I have their begrudging acceptance. I am free because I have let go of the need for it. The little girl with the lumpy clay dragon is no longer hiding in the shadows of my heart. She stands beside the woman I became, both of them holding a lantern, illuminating a path that I built for myself, one imperfect, beautiful step at a time. The light isn't for anyone else to approve of anymore. It's simply mine to hold, and it is and has always been enough.